They thought the most dangerous thing in that cabin was a gun. It wasn't. When a Virginia plantation owner was found dead in 1824, everyone assumed it was another violent slave rebellion, rage, chaos, revenge. But the real trigger wasn't a weapon at all. It was a quiet correction in the margins of a ledger. One small detail exposed something the system couldn't afford to admit. And what happened in that courtroom was so threatening, the records were burned. This is a real American crime story they tried to erase.
The most dangerous weapon found at the crime scene wasn't the flintlock pistol. It wasn't the bloodied iron poker lying near the fireplace. It was a piece of paper. It was a single sheet of parchment hidden beneath the floorboards of a slave cabin in rural Virginia, 1824. On it, written in perfect flowing Arabic script, was a genealogy, a history, a declaration of war against the reality of the American South. When the sheriff arrived at the plantation of Thomas Holloway, he expected a typical slave rebellion. He expected chaos, rage, and the brutish violence that terrified white society. But what he found was silence. Holloway was dead, seated in his chair, eyes wide open, and the man accused of killing him, a field hand known only as Jabari, wasn't running. He was sitting on the porch, waiting. He didn't look like a murderer. He looked like a judge who had just delivered a verdict. When they interrogated him, Jabari didn't plead for mercy. He didn't speak in the broken pidgin English they expected. He spoke clearly, calmly, and with a terrifying intelligence that made the deputies lower their guns in confusion. He told them that no crime had been committed. He told them he had simply enforced a law that superseded their own. This isn't just a story about a slave killing a master. If it were, you would have read about it in history books. Violent rebellions like Nat Turner's were publicized to spread fear. But Jabari's story was different. It was buried. The court transcripts were sealed. The witnesses were silenced. Why? Because Jabari Mansa didn't just threaten a plantation owner's life. He threatened the single lie that held the entire American economy together. The idea that the enslaved were less human than their enslavers. This is the forbidden story of Jabari Mansa. And the terrifying thing isn't what happened to him, it's what happened to the truth. To understand why this case was erased, we have to look at the legal and psychological landscape of 1820s America. The system of chattel slavery relied on a very fragile psychological trick. It required total control, not just of the body, but of the narrative. The enslaved had to be seen as intellectually blank, spiritually void, and incapable of higher reasoning. If a slave killed a master in a fit of rage, it reinforced the narrative. They were dangerous animals. But if a slave killed a master out of principle, based on a complex understanding of international law and theology, that was a virus. That was an idea that could burn the country down. Jabari Mansa entered the historical record as cargo, but before he was chained in the hold of a ship, oral traditions and fragmented letters suggest he was a scholar, likely from the Fouta Djallon region of West Africa. He wasn't just literate, he was aristocracy. He was a man who had studied the Quran, mathematics, and law, while the men who would eventually buy him were still learning to sign their names. He arrived in Virginia in 1818. For 6 years, he played the part. This is the first overlooked detail of the case, the patience. Psychological profiling of high-intelligence offenders shows they often possess an uncanny ability to mask their capabilities until the critical moment. Jabari didn't reveal his English. He didn't reveal his literacy. He watched. He worked the fields of Thomas Holloway, a man known for his erratic temper and deep insecurity. Holloway was a failed politician, a man drowning in debt who took his failures out on his property. The friction began not with a whip, but with a book. 3 weeks before the murder, Holloway found a ledger. It was a plantation accounting book, but the margins were filled with corrections. Someone had corrected Holloway's math. Someone had fixed his spelling. To Holloway, this wasn't just vandalism, it was a haunting. It implied that someone in his household, someone he viewed as livestock, was smarter than him. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. It breeds paranoia. Holloway began tearing apart the cabins, looking for the culprit. He found Jabari, but he didn't find Jabari hiding. He found him reading. In most stories, this is where the punishment happens, but the dynamic here was stranger. Holloway didn't whip him immediately. He was paralyzed by it.
He brought Jabari into the main house. We know this from the testimony of a house servant named Sarah, which was preserved in a private diary long after the official records were burned. She described a surreal scene, the master and the slave sitting in the study, Holloway trying to prove his dominance by debating scripture, and Jabari dismantling his arguments one by one. For a week, the power dynamic on the plantation flipped. Holloway was the owner, but Jabari was the master, and Holloway couldn't handle it. His worldview was collapsing. If this man was his intellectual superior, then his ownership of him was not a divine right, it was a kidnapping. Holloway decided to reassert reality the only way he knew how: violence. He planned to break Jabari publicly the following morning. He told the overseers to prepare the post. He needed to turn Jabari back into an animal to save his own sanity. That night, Thomas Holloway died. The investigation was botched from the start because the investigators couldn't conceive of the crime's motive. When the sheriff arrived, Jabari handed him the ledger. He handed him the Bible, and he handed him a letter he had written to the governor of Virginia. Jabari wasn't claiming self-defense in the physical sense, he was claiming status. He argued that as a nobleman and a scholar, his enslavement was a violation of international treaties. He argued that Holloway was a criminal holding a diplomat hostage, and that his death was an act of lawful execution under the laws of God and nations. This is where the story shifts from a murder case to a systemic crisis. They took Jabari to the county jail. The trial was set to be a formality, a quick hanging. But Jabari refused a lawyer. He insisted on speaking for himself. And this is what the authorities hadn't counted on: the audience. People came from miles around. They wanted to see the monster. Instead, they saw a man standing tall in the dock, speaking better English than the judge. Jabari began to cross-examine the witnesses. He didn't ask about the night of the murder. He asked about the nature of property. He asked the sheriff if a stolen horse remains the property of the thief. When the sheriff said no, Jabari asked, then how can a stolen man belong to the thief who bought him? The courtroom went quiet. This wasn't a defense, it was an indictment. The judge, a man named Eldridge, realized what was happening. Jabari wasn't trying to save his life. He knew he was going to die. He was using the courtroom as a printing press. He was putting his words on the official record. If the transcripts were written down, they would exist forever. Future generations would see that a black man had put slavery on trial and won the argument even if he lost the case. The tension in that room must have been suffocating. You have to imagine the white landowners looking at each other, realizing that the man in chains was articulating the very fears they suppressed every night. Judge Eldridge made a decision that changed the course of history. He didn't just sentence Jabari to death, he ordered the court cleared. He ordered the stenographer to stop writing. This is the forbidden part of the story. Usually, the execution of a slave was a public spectacle. It was meant to deter others. But Eldridge realized that making Jabari a martyr was dangerous. If they hanged him publicly, he might give a final speech.
He might say something that the slaves in the crowd would never forget. So the official story changed. The records state that the trial was suspended due to an outbreak of fever. They state that the prisoner died in his cell of natural causes. But the oral history, the whispers passed down through the families of the enslaved, the stories told in the back rooms of the county, tells a different version.
They say Jabari Mansa was taken out of the jail in the middle of the night. There was no gallows. There was no crowd. They took him into the deep woods, miles from the plantation. They didn't want a body to be found. A grave becomes a shrine. But before they killed him, the legend says Jabari asked for one thing. He didn't ask for water. He didn't ask to pray. He asked the sheriff, "Do you think burning the paper destroys the words?" They shot him and buried him in an unmarked pit. Then they went back to the courthouse. They took the transcripts of the first day of the trial, the pages where Jabari had argued his case, and they burned them in the stove. They went to Holloway's house and burned the ledger with the corrected math. They tried to scrub every physical trace of his intelligence from the world. They wanted him to be just another crazy slave who killed a master. They needed him to be crazy, because if he was sane, then they were the monsters. So why does this matter now? We look back at history and think we have the full picture. We rely on documents, court records, and newspaper articles. But the case of Jabari Mansa exposes the fatal flaw in that reliance. History is often curated by the people holding the match. The system didn't just steal Jabari's life, it stole his legacy. It robbed us of a hero. Imagine what it would have meant for the enslaved people of Virginia to know that one of their own had stood in a court of law and intellectually dominated his oppressors. That hope was dangerous, so it was extinguished. But here is the irony, the tragic absurdity of the cover-up. By erasing him, they proved him right. If Jabari had been a mindless brute, they would have paraded his body through the streets. They would have published every gory detail of the crime to justify their brutality. The fact that they hid him, that they silenced him, that they buried the records is the ultimate admission of fear. They were terrified of what he represented. This case forces us to ask an uncomfortable question about the history we consume. How many others were there? How many thinkers, poets, lawyers, and kings were ground up by the machinery of slavery, their brilliance deliberately erased because it didn't fit the narrative? We know about the rebels who used machetes. We rarely hear about the rebels who used logic, law, and literacy, because those were the weapons the system feared most. A machete can kill a man. A truth can kill a system. Jabari Mansa's story is a ghost story, not because he haunts a house, but because he haunts our understanding of the past. He is the missing page in the book. The investigation into his life leads to a dead end of ash and silence. We don't know where his body lies. We don't have the manifesto he wrote. We don't even know if Jabari Mansa was his real name or just the name he chose to die with, a name that means brave king. But we know he was there. We know because of the silence he left behind. In the end, America tried to erase him forever. They burned the papers. They buried the body. They swore the witnesses to secrecy. But in the quiet corners of history, where the light usually doesn't reach, you can still feel the heat of the fire they set to hide him. And you have to wonder, what other truths went up in smoke that night? History is written by the victors, but the truth is often hidden by the fearful. If you want to help us uncover more forgotten stories,
dig into the archives, and shine a light on the things they tried to hide, make sure you subscribe to the channel. We are just getting started.